Hi, I'm Ed Collins. I worked at WKY-TV from 1967 to 1970. My roommate at the time, Richard Leonard, was working out there, and he took me out, introduced me to Jay Spivey, who was running the stage area. Was hired, doing just about every aspect of radio and TV. We did props, we did set design, ran the cameras, did lighting. I think the first day on the job we changed cameras from what they call the TK40s and loaded the TK42s onto a new pedestal. Continuation of the color direction that WKY was taking. Lighting was pretty interesting because you were on a big tall platform that supposedly scooted across the floor, and you had a hook where you would grab a hold of the lighting rafters and pull yourself along. And you'd be carrying these rather heavy, they were called 5K lights, in one arm and trying to scoot across 20 feet above the ground on the other and hang them from the rack up there. Primarily, there were two station operations. One was the live studio, Studio B, and John Spence, who was producing these, ran the other studio, Studio C, which was primarily for taping and commercials. 12 o'clock noon. Ernie Schultz, the news director of WKY. Every day from 12 to 12:30. Jack Ogle came in at 6 o'clock. I think you might have heard the Ogle name around town a little bit. And at 10 o'clock, George Tomic. George and I are still in touch. He's still a fine journalist and anchor. And we had Jim Williams primarily as the weatherman. I didn't grow up in Oklahoma, but I soon learned that in Oklahoma, weather often is the news, and he did a tremendous job on that as well. All of them were consummate professionals. The sports was Mike Treps. Mike had a weekend anchor that came in from KONR in Norman named Bob Berry, and later Bob Berry Sr. was what he began to be referred to, and of course he took over after Mike retired. At 3 o'clock on Sunday afternoons, we had the OU football playbacks. They would run the film processors literally all night long, splice it all together, and we would go live with the OU game from the day before in the studio at 3 o'clock. We'd turn the lights out, and of course Mike would follow along with the film and be commenting on it, and sometimes the film would break and you'd have to go running back there and get all the studio lights back on real quickly as we came back live. The Chuck Fairbanks show was taped out there. The starting time, as I recall, was around midnight. Could go until almost dawn. Later became the Barry Switzer show. That's where I first ran into some of the people that I've admired my whole life, like Steve Owens and a lot of the OU football players. It was hosted by Howard Newman, again a fine gentleman and a consummate professional. After the 12 o'clock news, we had Danny Williams, and his show was called Danny's Day. He was primarily working alone back then. He was later joined by Mary Hart, but he was working pretty much by himself then, a 30-minute show. A lot of celebrities would drop by. That's where I first met Jane Giroux, who was beginning her reign as Miss America. And I still treasure her friendship. She's still a beautiful person on the inside and the outside to this day. I think one of the funnest shows was the Foreman Scotty show. Steve Powell did a masterful job back then. The girls would show up in ponytails and pigtails, and they wanted him to flip their hair, and the big thing was celebrating your birthday sitting on the old wooden horse, which I think is down at the Historical Society. His name was Woody. And I was running camera often then, and it was my huge responsibility to select the kid that got the golden horseshoe for the day. One of the most important things I'm sure that you can ever do in your lifetime. They were doing live commercials back then. I don't remember the gentleman's full name, but we called him Stoney. He would come on and do Cole Haan commercials. We would pour ice for frozen drinks, whether they would call slushies or Slurpees or whatever, and the kids loved that. And there are some legends on the Foreman Scotty show. One time, apparently, there were a bunch of kids giggling in the back, and he went back and said, "What's going on back here?" And they made a comment about a kid who had passed some gas. I asked Steve about that later. He swears it never happened, and I've talked to people who say they were watching the day it did happen. I don't know whether it did or not. I was there the day that this happened. Foreman Scotty was coming down the front row of the kids, and he got to one kid and said, "What's your name?" And the kid opened his mouth and just hurled all the way out well into the studio. That happened live on television. And I'll never forget the interesting arrangement, because the kids all scooted back and there was an entire circle of empty seats around him as they moved away from him. One time the weather really changed unexpectedly in Oklahoma City, and we were hit by a pretty severe blizzard, and it basically shut down Oklahoma City. And the kids, we had I think 40 of them out there at the studio, no way to get them home. So I remember on the 10 o'clock news that night, we had every blanket and couch and easy chair and rug and everything out in the studio, and we were able to broadcast live these kids on the Foreman Scotty show, so their parents watching at home could rest assured that they were in good care. We also taped Foreman Scotty's series. He had a little series running every day. People like Danny Williams, Wilson Hurst, many other people would take part as various characters in this series. I played a few myself. One, I played an escaped gorilla from the zoo, and I did a couple of weeks worth wearing a gorilla suit. So that was taped on Monday afternoon and shown throughout the week. Wallace Wildlife. He's still a wonderful man. I don't think anybody who was alive at that time will ever forget his character, Effie Mae Farquhar. And I remember on Wallace Wildlife, Don gave away lots of fishing lures as prizes. On Saturday night, we would tape championship wrestling. We did not set up the ring, that was contracted out, but we would set up the bleachers. And people would be lining up from early Saturday afternoon to be the first in the door for the taping of that show that night. And then after that, we were to tear the bleachers down, and we'd slide the big long boards out. I remember one time a splinter embedded about 6 inches in my leg, and it's still there to this day, so I have a memory of the championship wrestling bleachers embedded in me permanently. The wrestlers would show up sometimes in their Cadillacs wearing a mask, and wore the mask the entire time and drove off from the studio wearing a mask. That was an interesting time. Again, that was Danny Williams that was primarily emceeing that. Mentioned John Spence and his commercial studio. I worked over there also several years. All the local commercials, Don Mathis, I can still remember him throwing back his head and saying, "If you've lived in a furnished apartment, come on down and see our whole house full of furniture." Eleanor Camber, no one who was around then can ever forget where you'll always find unusual, and Eleanor was the sweetest lady. We did Evans Furniture. Lots of commercials were cut over there, and we tried to work some fun in between and probably blow off some steam. That I remember one time Ed Fazell and I were running camera. It was between sets, and we got to feeling a little rambunctious in the back and started chasing each other around back there on the stage with fire extinguishers, shooting them off, and we're screaming and hollering and come around the corner, and we run right into the director of the whole operation, Joe Jerkins. And he kind of looked at us, and I thought, okay, we're either fired or he's going to laugh. And he just said, "Don't ever do that again." We said, "Yes, sir." I think the most nationwide recognized thing we did was film the Buck Owens show. I think it went from 1966 to 1972. The whole studio was turned into the ranch at the Buck Owens show, and they'd come out and for about a week would film, and that would last for months on the national TV. I remember when they were around, there was a string of admirers that always attended them. I'm trying to remember some of the names that were on the show. I remember Jimmy Dean, Charlie Pride, Conway Twitty, Susan Ray, Don Rich, the Stamps Quartet, Roy Clark. Show lasted and ran a long time. The Scene was a teenage show pretty much based on American Bandstand Dick Clark by Ronnie Kay. Ronnie was light years ahead in his vision of what this could be, and his wife Deanna recruited kids to go dance on the show, and it became a phenomenon. I worked some of the sock hops that he would put on, but the show just was fabulous. I had a little chance to talk to him not long ago, and we went through some of the performers that showed up while he was out there in those about 6 or 7 years that he ran it. A guy named Brian Hyland was on the show one time. Sealed with a Kiss, Gypsy Woman, but you may know him, probably his most famous song. He talked about a woman wearing an itsy bitsy teeny weeny yellow polka dot bikini. The Animals with Eric Burton, Harry Chapin, Bo Diddley, Sugarloaf, The Spinners, Otis Redding, Ray Charles, Mitch Ryder and the Detroit Wheels, Smokey Robinson, The Temptations, Dick and Dee Dee, Jan and Dean, The Kingsmen, The Guess Who, Ike and Tina Turner, James Brown. I remember James Brown had a whole cast of attending people, and he would just stand up and put his arms out, and they would put his coat on and fix his hair and dust him off. And I think one of the funnest acts we ever had live was Jerry Lee Lewis, and he had a song called Great Balls of Fire. As I remember, when that broke, it sold 6 million records almost overnight. And he was doing it live, and we brought in our beautiful piano, whether it was a Steinway or something comparable, I don't know, and he was down there playing, and halfway through the song, he stood up and kicked that seat of that beautiful piano back, and it clattered against the far wall of the studio, and you could hear the people in the control room gasping. But I'm telling you, there was a lot of electricity in that studio as he was doing that performance. We had those big cameras, and we'd be circulating among the kids while they were dancing. They had big, thick cables, so we had to be kind of careful, but we put some great footage, and you can find some of it still on YouTube. I was doing my student teaching at the time, and we were right in the middle of all these kids, and I remember bumping a girl in the head with the camera, and I said, "Oh, I'm sorry." She said, "That's okay, Mr. Collins." I thought, "Uh-oh, that's one of my students." All of this was wonderful experience. I went on to the radio news while I was working in TV as well. I would have probably stayed in that career, but I was interrupted by the draft at the time. They had a little war going on in Vietnam, and decided they needed me. My last night of work for WKY TV and radio was covering the election of the 1970 gubernatorial race. They assigned me to the American candidate. His name was Rule Little. Dewey Bartlett was the incumbent, overwhelming favorite. The polls were ridiculously lopsided in his favor, and so most of the new staff was there, and they sent a guy named Jerry Fontaine to take the concession statement from David Hall. I think the results were so clear-cut that people didn't vote or whatever, but as you know, David Hall upset Dewey Bartlett, and there was lots of scrambling to get all the news people back there to cover him in time. So I went off, and it worked out okay. I went to the military and began a career of flying, commercial and military, and I wound up doing that for the next 34 years. The interesting thing, when I got to basic training, the jukebox there had about half the songs were by Buck Owens, so I really hadn't gotten very far away. And if you can never find a reel-to-reel tape, I have a bunch of my old newscasts recorded on tape, including the one that I think it was Sammy Moon, the disc jockey, said, "Let's say goodbye to Private Ed Collins," as he marches off. There was an amazing group of people assembled in the production of all of these events out there at WKY. I'm trying to remember some of the names. Some other tapes probably will mention some that I'm leaving out, but these are ones that have stuck with me. Pete Richmond, Willard Hines, Ken Copeland, Bob Hayward, Ned Leach, Lester Tucker, Aaron Britton. As you know, WKY was the first local television station west of the Mississippi, which is why it has the W call letters. And one of the proudest things, they were the first live local color broadcast of any independent station in the country. And it's my understanding, I've heard this story, and so if I'm telling it now, it must be true. One of the engineers wept as the first color broadcast was in fact shown live on TV from this station right here. Amazing people. Doyle Glazier and his art staff could come up with any design that you needed. Just phenomenal jobs on slates and backdrops and all those things. We had a real family. I remember playing in softball games with other radio and TV stations. In fact, a few years ago I ran into Jerry Park and we were reminiscing about how much fun those softball games were back then. I'm proud to have been a part of this television experience. It was a phenomenal part of my life, and I'll never forget the people that I worked with. WKY really was a family.